Okay, thanks, Chris, for that introduction. And that's exactly what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about managing the fire service training program, and we're going to specifically dive into the needs assessment and talk about three different steps or phases that we're going to use to conduct a needs assessment to identify what training is actually needed by your fire department or organization. So, managing the fire service training program, how many times have you gone to the firehouse and heard the term, "What are we doing for drill tonight?" So if you are hearing that term when you go to the firehouse, especially on a regular basis, you're probably not operating under a properly managed fire service training program. Adults are need to know learners. They need to understand exactly what's going on, and they need to know their expectations before we put them into a situation and expect something of them. So what we always want to do is we always want to prepare our adult learner prior to the training that we're going to be giving them. Okay, so managing the fire service training program is one of the most time-consuming tasks there is in the fire service. There is a lot to do. Outside of the fire chief, probably the training officer has the most responsibility. So it's not uncommon for a training officer to get way in over their head or get behind quickly, and then you get into these situations where people are showing up not knowing exactly what they're doing for drill. But we can solve that when we understand how to manage the fire service training program properly. So let's just take a look at some of the stuff the training officer has to do, some of the responsibilities of the training officer. Okay, they got to identify the requirements, a little bit what we're going to talk about today. They got to identify the skill level of the firefighters that they're going to be teaching. They have to develop a process to assess that skill. They got to figure out what kind of skills they're working with already and what kind of skills they need to develop. They got to identify what training is needed outside of those requirements, and they got to develop a plan to meet those requirements. And then they're going to develop a schedule of training sessions that delivers that training. They got to develop lessons for each session that they're going to deliver, and a presentation needs to be built for each lesson that is going to be delivered. Not to mention, we need to deliver each training session to a captive audience, which can be challenging all on its own. And then we got to record that training session and maintain those records. So this is just a little bit of what the training officer is responsible for. And as you can see, it's quite an extensive list. There was a lot to being the training officer. There was a lot to managing the fire service training program. So how do we do that? How do we eat that elephant one bite at a time, right? So we eat that elephant one bite at a time. And the best way to do that is to break it up into little steps. So we break it up into five different steps that help us manage little parts or little bits of the fire service training program so we can accomplish the entire task in little bites. And those five steps are: first, we perform a needs assessment. We find out what training the fire department actually needs. Where does the fire department need to be spending their time and spending their energy developing training for their membership? Once we understand the needs, we're going to develop a program to meet those needs. And that program is going to deliver that needs assessment in a logical uh, operation that we call program operations. So we're going to operate that program through a specific methodology that allows us to present that needed training to the membership themselves. And just like we need to evaluate the skills of our firefighters, we also need to perform a evaluation of the program itself to make sure that the program is actually working and it's delivering the message that we're trying to get out to our membership. Okay, and then we got to retain those records. We have to record everything that we do and keep those records on file. So let's start out with step one. And what we're going to do here is we're going to spend a little bit of time here on step one and talk about that needs assessment. So we break the needs assessment up into two parts. Those are the internal need assessment and then the external need assessment. We'll start out with the external need assessment. So the external need assessment is going to be things that are outside of the organization that are required of the organization. Okay, so these are going to be basically laws, both federal and state, as well as some specific local laws that require your organization to perform specific training. This is usually labor law related. Okay, so this usually falls back on the state's labor law where they require you to do certain types of training with each employee. And your volunteer firefighter members of your organization are considered employees. Okay, that's under common law. Now, standards is another thing. So we fall under several different standards when we're talking about the fire service in general. The first standard is OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. It's their standard 1910-156, which is what we call the fire brigade standard. And then there's NFPA 1001, National Fire Protection Association Standard 1001, which is this knowledge and skills standard for professional firefighters. So firefighter level 1 and firefighter 2. And then there's mandates. And what mandates are ways that state governments, local governments, they gap certain needs, needs of legislation. They gap the needs of the public versus what is currently in legislation. And to build those gaps when they don't have legislation to support the needs of the public, they create mandates. And a lot of our mandated training is that sexual harassment training, workplace violence, bloodborne pathogens, hazardous materials. If you have an employee that's going to be handled or around hazardous materials, they have to be specifically trained on that. So that's called Article 26 law. So there's several different external requirements that our members are going to need to have on an annual basis. Okay, and those are going to be found again based on federal, state, and local laws. Those are the external needs. Now, if we take a deeper look into the internal needs, those are the organizational needs. That's what your organization as a whole is going to need. Okay, so that is also going to be based on our OSHA Fire Brigade Standard 29 CFR 1910-156. That's going to basically spell out exactly how we can identify those organizational needs, but it's going to be based on what your fire department does or what is it organized to do. That's basically where we're going to be heading with this. Okay, so now OSHA approved state plans. So what is an OSHA state? What is an OSHA state approved plan? Do I have to follow OSHA? We're not an OSHA state. We hear all these different types of things, and it gets relatively confusing. But let me explain this. There's 3 different ways that OSHA can be applied to your locality. Okay, so OSHA does cover the entire 50 states of the United States. Okay, and the way it does that is it does it through one of 3 different ways. Either you have a federal OSHA requirement, which basically is for private sector employees as well as federal employees of those states, but it does not pertain to municipal employees or public employees. All right, so that's shown here in dark green, and you can see it kind of goes right up from Florida all the way up through the center heart of the United States, right down the middle up to Montana and Idaho. So those are federal OSHA states. So what that means is if we have a private fire company operating in the state of Texas, let's say it's a rural metro fire department, that's a private company, they have to follow OSHA 1910-156. However, in the city of Houston, Texas, which is a municipal fire department, all right, they do not necessarily have to follow the OSHA 1910-156. However, it's still a great idea. It's still a good idea to base all of your training requirements on the OSHA 1910-156 because it's a real fluid way of creating training requirements or identifying training requirements for your organization. Now, when we look at the states that are in the light green or the gray, depending on how you can view it on your screen, those are OSHA approved state plans. And what those do is those apply to both private sector and public employees. Meaning that if you are in the state of California and you are operating a privately owned fire company, you would fall under OSHA. As well as if you were in the state of California and you were working for the San Jose Fire Department, okay? A municipal fire department falls underneath California's state-approved OSHA plan. So both private and public employees fall under OSHA in those states. And now we have these other states, the odd states, the states that are kind of lined out here with the green, and that's Illinois, New York, Maine, Connecticut, I believe, yes, New Jersey, and Rhode Island. Those states have OSHA state-approved plans, but they're for public employees only, okay? So private sector employees are covered by federal OSHA, okay? So what happens in these states is there's this thing called PESH, Public Employee Safety and Health Administration. It's just like OSHA. It follows the OSHA standards. It follows all the OSHA regulations, but the entity that manages the program, the enforcer of the program, so to speak, is PESH, Public Employee Safety and Health Administration. So hopefully that clears up some of the confusion. Look for your state here and understand, are you an OSHA approved state plan? Do you fall under the federal OSHA laws? Or are you OSHA state approved only for private, or excuse me, only for public employees, and your private and federal employees are covered under federal OSHA. So the fire brigade standard, what is it? Well, it's 1910-156 is its chapter number, okay, and it contains requirements for the organization's training and personal protective equipment uh, whenever a fire department is established. So they use the term here fire brigade, but fire brigade does not necessarily mean an industrial fire brigade. It just simply implies any fire organization. So it doesn't matter if the fire department is organized as a private fire department, if it's organized as a village fire department, or maybe it's a fire protection district, or maybe it's just a fire district itself, okay? Fire brigade covers all of those. And 1910-156 applies whenever one is established. And the employer is now going to be the administrative people of the organization itself. So if it was a village fire department, then the village would be the employer of the volunteer firefighter operating in the side of that village fire department. So 1910-156, it starts right out with this thing we call the organizational statement. And this is where it becomes critical to understand OSHA and how it operates, because you get to basically state in your organizational statement what is the existence of your organization? Why does your organization exist? What does it do? The statement is going to identify the exact organizational structure that you operate under. Okay, so that's your management structure. You probably have a fire chief with several assistants and then a bunch of captains and maybe some lieutenants, and then that goes all the way down to firefighters. Okay, so what is that organizational structure? What does it look like? How are you organized as far as management goes? What are the functions of the organization? And this is where we're going to spend some of our time here a little bit later this morning talking about the function of the organization. What is it that the organization does? Is this organization, is it formed to respond to hazardous materials incidents, or has this organization been organized to respond to structural firefighting, or maybe it's just a rescue operation that performs auto extrication and RIT operations? Okay, a bunch of different ways a fire department can actually be organized. Okay, and then the other thing we're going to write in this organizational statement is the type, the amount, and the frequency of training. Okay, so we're going to build into this whole statement exactly who we are, what we do, and how we do it. That's what an organizational statement does. Okay, so they're going to want to know how many people you have, what's that leadership hierarchy look like, what does your leadership pyramid look like, what do you do, what functions do you perform, what services do you provide? Do you provide EMS? Do you provide motor vehicle accident extrication? Do you provide hazardous materials incident response? Do you provide special operations rescue, such as rope or water? Okay, and then how do you prepare? What type of training do you do? What is the frequency of your training? And what is the amount of your training? So how often do you train? Do you train every week? Do you train every month, every quarter, so on and so forth? And then how much training are you requiring of your membership? That's everything that needs to go into this organizational statement. And this organizational statement is going to make it real easy for us to do our needs assessment here as we move on. Okay, so that internal needs assessment, we're going to break it up into 3 different phases. Phase 1 is going to identify the what. What is it that we do? What is it that we need? Phase 2, we're going to identify the when. When are we going to train? Okay, and then we're going to identify how are we going to train? What are the hows? What do we need to do? So it answers those 3 things that the organizational statement was looking for, but we'll break it up into phases so we can do an actual needs assessment inside of our organization, breaking it up, breaking those little pieces into smaller pieces. Okay, so identifying the what, phase 1. Okay, so the employer needs to provide training and education for all members commensurate with their duties and functions that they are expected to perform. What the key here is that you have to provide your firefighters with any type of training that you expect them to be able to perform on the fire ground. So let's start off, we'll just talk about ground ladders. So if we expect our firefighter to be able to carry a ground ladder, throw a ground ladder, and climb a ground ladder on the fire ground, we have to train our firefighter how to carry, throw, and climb a ground ladder prior to arriving on the fire ground. Okay, that's the key point here. So back 50 years ago, what would happen is there was on-the-job training, right? So a firefighter would get on the fire truck when there was a fire, and then some of the senior members would take that firefighter under their wing and kind of show the kid what to do, so to speak. Okay, what we're looking for here is that we are training our firefighters prior to their feet hitting the fire ground. Okay, so those internal requirements are going to be based on function. So if you are expecting your firefighters to perform any function, you're going to have to train them on that. And that function is going to be identified in that organizational statement. And you know, what else is nice about this is we don't have to train firefighters on things we're not expecting them to do or to be able to manage. For instance, maybe your fire department is a salvage only fire department. We don't need to train our firefighters in making hydrants or throwing ladders or using hose lines if the only function of the firefighters that we're responding with, if their only function is salvage. We only have to train them in tarps, water removal, so on and so forth. Okay, so we're going to train based on that organizational function. And again, that type, the amount, and the frequency. So all of this according to function. So if you're a structural firefighting fire department, you need to train your firefighters in suppression. They need to understand how to operate hose lines, how to maneuver hose, how to put a line on the fire at the seat of the fire, how to break the plane of the building or the room that's on fire. We're going to have to teach them tactical ventilation skills, have them understand how ventilation is the introduction of fresh air and the removal of very bad air. And then we're going to have to teach them how to throw ladders, perform rescue, do search, so on and so forth. Those are the functions. And what we do is we identify all the little individual skills that are required. So suppression isn't just putting water on the fire. We have to move the hose. We have to stretch the hose. We have to advance the hose once it's charged. We have to open the nozzle and then maneuver the nozzle. So there's a bunch of other skills that are built into there. That's what we're going to have to identify and develop so we can train on those and build and develop those skills. So beyond structural firefighting, maybe your fire department responds to motor vehicle accidents. So we have to train our firefighters how to handle the motor vehicle accident. We have to train them in auto extrication. Okay. Your fire department responds to hazardous materials incidents. So what level of a hazardous material incident do they respond to? Are you at the awareness level where you can just identify, hey, we have a hazardous materials incident, we need to get some help? Are you at the operational level where you can do some diking of certain materials? Or are you a technician level fire department? You need to train your firefighters to the level that they are expected to perform on the fire ground itself. Same would hold true with special rescue operations. Okay, so if you have water in your fire district, it doesn't mean that you have to have training on water rescue operations. But if you have water in your fire district and you have a boat or you perform water rescue, then you have to train on that water rescue. And the same holds true for anything that we do. So such as RIC, Rapid Intervention Crew. If you're responding mutually to nearby fire departments and providing them with a RIC while they are at a working structure fire, then we need to train our firefighters in the specialty aspects of that job as well. Same with the marine units. So if we had a fireboat, the training on our fireboat would be the same training that we give our people on our engine companies. Okay. The training is commensurate to the duty that you are expecting them to do. So we need to identify all these different duties and all different skills. Okay. So now the fire department leadership and the people who are doing the training, they need to have even more training and more education than the firefighters that they're training. So that's the other thing that OSHA 1910-156 tells us. In chapter C1, they tell us this, that we have to have training above and beyond that of the general membership. It only makes sense that the people who are going to be leading these firefighters and training these firefighters have some training that's a step above. So now we've identified what here as far as what training we have to deliver to the people who we are expecting to perform the training. So fire instructors, they're going to have formal training in presentation, preparation, application, and evaluation. Those are the four main topics that we should be giving extra training to our people who are going to train. It makes no sense to have somebody get up in front of a crowd. A person could be an absolute expert in whatever topic they're trying to teach. But if they don't understand how to prepare their lesson, present their lesson, and apply and evaluate the people who are taking that lesson, then we're wasting the time of the people who are taking that lesson. Okay, there's a specific way to get our message across, and our fire instructors need to have specific training in that skill. Okay, so the employer also has to have a training frequency that is delivering the training enough to keep the skills of the firefighter fresh. So basically, that's the frequency of training. Okay, the fire brigade, um, we need to keep our firefighters competent in their skills, and that competent word is a huge word. Okay, so the firefighters must maintain competency with their skills. Some skills are used way more often than others. Those skills, maybe we don't have to train on as much as we need to train on those skills, those finite skills that maybe we only use once or twice a year. Maybe we need to train on those more because to keep the competency level of that skill up, it requires more training because the frequency of using it on the job is less. Okay, so competence, skill, and knowledge. Knowledge and skill are are two different things. Knowledge is knowing what to do, when to do it, and then skill is knowing how to do it, where to do it. Okay, and we need to understand and break those two things down. So knowledge and skill, what knowledge and skill do they need to know, can come to us right from NFPA 1001, the professional firefighter standard that tells us all the knowledge and skill abilities that a firefighter needs to perform their job effectively. But at a minimum, what the fire brigade standard tells us is that at a minimum, training must be done at least annually. So we have to annually train our firefighters at least. And then interior firefighters or firefighters who are expected to wear an SCBA, they must have training sessions at least quarterly. So I truly believe that firefighters need to be trained way more than quarterly if they're going to be operating proficiently in an SCBA. So basically, what our model is at Vigilant is if we can make you really good and master the skills of hose, ladders, and SCBA or PPE, you will be an effective firefighter. And that's going to require training. I believe that is more frequent than quarterly. Most fire departments train weekly, and that's a pretty good frequency as far as SCBA training goes. Okay, so our next chapter here is what type of training are we going to give them? How are we going to train these guys? What's the quality of this training and educational program? Well, what OSHA says that every member is going to be trained like those of state-run fire academies and the curriculum that is used in those fire academies. What's nice here is if a state purchases, in most cases, when a state purchases a specific curriculum, that should be available to most of the fire departments in that state as well. Now you might have to buy that curriculum, but at least the state is providing you with a method or a motive or an avenue of obtaining that special curriculum. So what we need to do here is we have to develop a program that delivers that standard curriculum in a logical sequence that covers the frequency that we require. Okay, so that's how we're going to do it. We're going to develop a program based on NFPA standards, and the curriculum is going to be that of our state fire academy, and then we're going to deliver that through a training plan to our firefighters using a logical sequence that allows them to take on one step at a time and build on the last step that we trained. Okay, and then that comes together in the end where we start putting all those skills together after putting them out in a logical sequence. So that's our needs assessment. That's exactly how we should approach our needs assessment, by breaking it down into those three little parts and then looking at each one individually. And then what we have to do is move on to program development. So now this is where we're going to develop that program that's going to be based on the needs requirements that we identified during that needs assessment. So this is where we put together some training of those requirements and deliver it to our membership. Okay, so program development. So we identified that training. We identified what we needed to do with that training, or excuse me, we identified what we need to do as an organization, and then we identified training that we need to have to do that need. Now what we're going to do is we're going to break those down into individual job descriptions. So we're going to take a job description and develop these based on the needs of the organizational statement. So we look at our organizational statement, and we're a structural fire department, so we need firefighters who are going to go into a burning building, carry a hose, put water on the fire. We also need firefighters who are going to go into the building and search for victims, search for fire and victims. And we also need firefighters who are going to carry ladders onto the fire ground, climb onto the roof, cut holes in the roof, so on and so forth. Each one of these is a job description. That job description has individual needs of itself, okay? So we develop a job description for each position. Maybe you have members who only are at the support level. They only fill air bottles, supply firefighters with water and rehab type activities. We build a job description for each different title of operation, and then we train those firefighters based on those job requirements, okay? So the job descriptions, each one of them will have a job performance requirement. And these job performance requirements are the skills needed for a specific type of a job, all right? So, and we group these always according to tactic and task, okay? So if our interior firefighter, we'll go back to the ladder, needs to understand how to carry, throw, and climb a ladder, okay? So that's a job performance requirement. That JPR was what we call them, means that the firefighter, we have to be able to check off the firefighter's skill ability on carrying, throwing, or raising, and then climbing ground ladders, okay? That would be one specific job performance requirement for the job description of interior firefighter. Okay, these are what's going to define the skill that each firefighter must be capable of doing to perform their duties. This is how we judge or evaluate competency. We have a list of skills, and then those skills are broken down into little steps that they have to do of each skill to show that they have competence in the actual skill we're asking them to perform. Okay, and we base those skills again on NFPA 1001. And NFPA 1001 identifies knowledge and skill ability needed for firefighter 1 and firefighter 2. So then we develop some curriculum, and we need to develop some lessons to deliver that knowledge and skill for each JPR. So if we go back to our ladder example, we would develop a lesson that teaches the firefighter what the parts of the ladder are called, how the ladder is constructed, how the ladder operates. We would show them a demonstration of how the ladder is put up properly, and a presentation how to climb the ladder. And then we would also develop a lesson that went out and coached them on how to do each one of those things as a psychomotor skill. Okay, so that means we've got to develop some delivery methods to present each one of these lessons. And we break those delivery methods down based on if it's a knowledge or skill requirement. Okay, so delivery methods that we're all used to when we talk about training and drilling. Oftentimes we use these two words as the same, training and drilling, but they are not. They're completely different things. Training is a formal method of presenting a new skill. So we're introducing a new skill or knowledge in a training session. So I sit the firefighter down and through a formal method show them this new knowledge or skill and show them what it looks like. Drilling, on the other hand, is when we actually take them out onto the training ground and we have them practice that skill. So they're actually putting their hands on. So in training, there is no hands on. It's a cognitive function. And then when we get out on the drilling grounds, that's where we apply the skill and we do psychomotor work. So two separate things, training and drilling. So with our training, that's usually going to be a lecture or a discussion, some type of a presentation, maybe even a demonstration or a video. So in our formal training, we're going to use these things independently to show what right looks like. Now, the delivery methods for lecture or discussion, they're instructor-led. So the instructor stands in front of the class and goes through the presentation explaining each one of these steps. We're typically using a PowerPoint here, and we most often use these PowerPoints to deliver some form of knowledge, okay? The demonstration, that's where we show the skill. We show what right looks like. We show exactly what performing the skill properly looks like so that they have a good idea of what that is. Okay, so moving on, now once we've practiced that skill, we do a skill drill where we allow them to keep practicing and develop their skills. And once they've developed their skills, we're going to apply that skill in an evolution or a scenario. So skill drills the practice of that specific skill, and that's where the Fire instructor is coaching, helping the student along, helping them develop the skill required. This is where we're out practicing that ladder throw, practicing climbing, using 3 points of contact, so on and so forth. Okay, and what we're trying to do is develop muscle memory as we drill the skill. So we want the firefighters with these skills to be able to do these skills without thinking about it. We want their minds not to be on performance of the skill, but we want their minds to be on the situation and have situational awareness as to what's going on around them, so that they don't have to focus on performing the skill. They can perform the skill while their focus is on the dangers or the hazards that they're performing the skill in that environment. Okay, and then the evolution, that's where we apply that new knowledge or skill. So we do some form of a thing. So let's, with our ladder example that we keep using, our ladder example would be, we've practiced the ladder, we've practiced the throwing of the ladder, we've practiced the climbing of the ladder. Now we're going to do an evolution. And the evolution is going to be event enter search from the second floor. So it's much more than just throwing a ladder here. We're just going to take the skill of throwing a ladder and apply it to a larger evolution where we're going to put it up to a building, climb the ladder, enter a window, search, and then exit the window, come back down the ladder. So we're applying that in a live scenario-based operation in a controlled environment. So once we've developed our program, figured out the skills, what skills we're going to have to teach, we now got to develop a program to operate through some form of methodology, some way that we can get this across to our firefighters in a logical method or manner. Okay, so what we use at Vigilant, our program methodology is something we call proficiency cycle training. The cycle builds competency by doing one step at a time and repeating that process over time. Okay, and it'll always start with training, so some formal training session where we show you what that skill is and teach you about the skill, and it will end with mastery. And we stay in the cycle until mastery is achieved. And again, mastery in this case means that we can perform the skill correctly with muscle memory. So this process always starts out with training. That's where we sit and have our formal introduction of that new concept or skill. All right, it's a formal presentation, typically using a PowerPoint or some form of demonstration. We then drill on that skill where we're out there practicing the skill. So now we completely repeat this over and over and over again through good coaching and good practicing skills to develop that skill into something that starts to develop that muscle memory. And we use a 5-step psychomotor process, which is something we'll talk about in a couple of webinars from now. But we use a 5-step process there too to introduce the skill and have them completely comprehend the skill that we're trying to teach. Once they've practiced the skill, they've got the skill pretty well down, we apply it in an evolution. As that evolution is going on, also, we're evaluating that evolution. So we're evaluating that skill while they are performing it. And depending on how that evaluation goes, is whether or not we move on or we start to retrain. But anyways, through that evaluation, we've developed remediation training. So let's say that maybe during our evaluation, we found that the firefighter was putting the ladder upside down. Well, we've identified that there's a problem with the firefighter's understanding of the butt end from the tip of the ladder. So we remediate some training. We develop training, complete the proficiency cycle, go back to drilling, apply it again, evaluate it again, and then remediate it. And this completes the loop, and we develop mastery by just completely maintaining that loop over and over again through training, drilling, evolution, evaluation, and remediation. So we take all of our requirements, all of our lessons that we've developed with the understanding that we're going to train, we're going to drill, we're going to perform or apply it in an evolution, and we develop an annual training plan. And that training plan basically uses a proficiency cycle to deliver the curriculum that we've developed through the needs that we've identified. And that plan is going to use a logical sequence to deliver all of this training into little manageable blocks. Just like we're trying to manage the fire service training program into small blocks, small chunks, we're going to deliver that training program to the firefighters in those small chunks as well. Okay, and that might be weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, quarterly, and annually, depending on the training that we're developing. Right. So we talked about we want to be able to train our firefighters in PPE and SCBA weekly, but maybe we only have to show them how to dike a hazardous material spill on an annual basis. Okay, so it all depends on that skill and that knowledge, what we're talking about, whether we need to repeat that training weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, or quarterly. So the training plan is then developed into a schedule. So we take all of the lessons that we're going to teach and we put them into a schedule. And each topic that we're going to get into is going to be begin with that training presentation, and then follow that with a skill drill session, and then we'll apply it in an evolution. And then we test these things during what we call company competencies. So this is a drill where the company comes down, and maybe the company competency is to stretch a inch and 3/4 hand line to the second floor of a simulated bedroom fire. It's a training, it's a rep, it's an evolution. Okay, but what we're doing here is, instead of testing each individual company member or each individual skill member, we're testing it as a company to see how well the company operates. Because all in all, when we get out onto the actual fire ground, it's the performance of our companies that makes the fire ground effective. So we test that through a company competency, and then we identify that remediation training if needed and continue that going. So we need to also know and understand how our program is operating. So we've built our program, we're operating that program, maybe it's been up and running for maybe a year, and we need to understand now, is that program working? Is the training we're getting out to our firefighters working? Are they retaining what we're trying to teach? The only way to do that is through a program evaluation. We have to evaluate the program just like we evaluate the firefighter. So the program evaluation, we evaluate the program just like we do the firefighters, and the leadership has to have an understanding of what the level of effectiveness is of the training program. Okay, so we have to evaluate every little part of the program, including lessons, presentations, and even instructors, which means that we have to sit around, or not sit around, but we have to show up at certain training sessions and see how the instructor is delivering the material that we're trying to teach. Okay, very important. We can manage this through pre and post testing. So one way to do this is to give our firefighters a test before the program comes out. We test them on a bunch of knowledge things. We don't have to do this written. It could actually be a performance test as well, where we're doing a company competency. And then we deliver our training, and then we test them afterwards to see how much they've retained or what they've picked up. So the same test given twice. And this isn't sitting firefighters down and giving them a written test. There's many forms of technology that are out there that are great to assist with this. A lot of stuff that we can have our firefighters do right on their phones, where it turns into like a game. And we'll be talking more about that in future webinars as well. So we've evaluated our program. Now we got to retain our records, okay? Record retention, real important part of the managing a fire training program. It's important because unrecorded training did not happen, right? So we have to record every single training session. So we have to make an individual training report that goes along with every training session. It identifies what our objectives were, what training we covered, how did we cover it? Was it a presentation? Was it a skill drill? Was it an evolution? And then who was at the training session? We have to give an attendance for each individual member that was at that training session. And then the individual members must also have their own permanent records kept, and we want to keep all of their training completions as well. So we want to keep a record of their initial training, any annual training that they've completed, any training that they've completed outside of the fire department itself. Maybe they went to a seminar or attended a state fire academy course. We want to be able to keep individual records just like we keep records of all of the individual sessions. Very, very, very important. Because when the records are called upon, they got to be there on hand to be able to prove the training that the firefighter and the fire department did. And this is going to help out in litigation cases. So all training records, they must be maintained and destroyed according to your own state regulations. So every state has their own schedule for record retention, and they keep a schedule of how to maintain that record as well as how to destroy that record once the repository period is over. So that's another important part, and that will also be one of our webinar coming up here in the future, is how to perform proper record retention for our fire service training program. Okay, so just let's close up on everything we talked about, wrap it up, bring it back together. Remember, we start out this entire management process with a needs assessment. We got to identify those internal and external needs. What training requirements does this fire department organization need to do on an annual basis? We then develop a program that's going to meet those needs, that's based on the job descriptions and the job performance requirements of the firefighters who are operating for us, dependent to the job or the service that we are providing. We then operate a program that uses a methodology called proficiency cycle training to deliver all of our curriculum in a logical method. Then we evaluate our program to make sure that the program is getting out to the membership exactly what we want to get out, and that our firefighters are developing in their skill and they're growing in their knowledge. And we retain all the records as far as each training session goes, and individual records for our individual members. Okay, so that's it in a shot, and that's going to wrap it up this week. I will turn it over to Chris for any questions. I thank you for being with us again for another week of our webinar on fire service training management, and I hope to see you guys all again next week. Thanks a lot.